He was a millionaire who believed success could be engineered. On May 21st, 2019, at 8,848 meters above sea level, he would discover that wealth cannot outbid physics or ego. And Mount Everest would remember him not as powerful, but as careless. May 21st, 2019. Southeast ridge of Mount Everest. Wind speed, 30 miles per hour, gusting higher. Temperature, -25 degrees Celsius at sunrise. Barometric pressure, roughly 1/3 of sea level. From a distance, the summit looked calm. The sky above Nepal was a clean, endless blue. No visible storm. No dramatic cloud plumes tearing from the summit ridge. To an inexperienced observer, it might have seemed like a safe window. But Everest does not need a storm to kill. Among the climbers preparing for the summit push from Camp 4 was Daniel Mercer, 46 years old, a technology investor from Dallas, Texas. Self-made, disciplined, competitive. He had built his fortune through calculated risk, markets, startups, aggressive timing. Everest, in his mind, was simply another high-stakes decision. He had trained for this moment. Hypoxic tense, endurance, conditioning. Guided climbs on Aconcagua and Denali. He trusted preparation. He trusted numbers. What he failed to understand was that this mountain erases margins. Mount Everest rises 8,848 meters into what climbers call the death zone. Above 8,000 meters, the human body begins a steady process of cellular breakdown. Oxygen saturation drops dangerously low. Cognitive function declines. Muscles weaken despite effort. The body cannot repair itself. It can only deteriorate more slowly. The southeast ridge, his chosen route, is exposed for nearly its entire length. It acts as a wind tunnel when the jet stream shifts south. Cornices hang like frozen waves above the Kangshung face, fragile structures formed by decades of wind-loaded snow. Beneath the surface, ice layers fracture unpredictably. At 8,500 meters, a single hour of delay can drain critical oxygen reserves. At 8,700 meters, decision-making becomes unreliable. At 8,800 meters, survival depends on timing measured in minutes. That season, more than 300 climbers were moving through the same narrow window. Fixed ropes along the ridge allowed only single-file movement. Congestion at these altitudes is not inconvenient. It is lethal. Everest's danger is mathematical. 3 liters of oxygen per minute. 6 hours per cylinder. 8 to 12 hours for a round-trip summit push, if nothing goes wrong. But something almost always does. As the sun rose, casting Everest's triangular shadow across Tibet, a slow procession of climbers moved upward from Camp 4 at 7,950 meters. Headlamps flickered out in the growing light. The wind remained steady. The temperature continued to fall in shaded sections of the ridge. Everything looked controlled. Everything looked manageable. And high above, at an altitude where the human brain quietly begins to betray itself, the margin for survival was already shrinking. Daniel Mercer did not come to Everest alone. At home in Dallas, Caroline Mercer followed the expedition's updates on her phone, refreshing satellite messages that arrived hours apart. She was 44, composed, protective, and far more aware of the risks than Daniel liked to admit. Their 2 sons, Ethan, 17, and Luke, 14, had told friends their father was climbing the tallest mountain in the world. There was pride in their voices. Daniel had framed the expedition as something noble. He told them Everest was about discipline, about proving that limits are mental constructs, about finishing what you start. He said he wanted his sons to see that fear should not dictate ambition. What he did not say was that ambition had begun to define him. He had grown up middle class in Texas. Nothing inherited, nothing guaranteed. He built his wealth through relentless work and an appetite for risk others avoided. Markets crash. Startups fail. But if you calculate correctly, you win. That mindset had followed him into the mountains. His Instagram account documented the journey with careful precision. Photos from base camp at 5,364 meters showed him smiling in a red-down jacket, prayer flags fluttering behind him. The caption read, "Dreams require altitude." Friends commented with fire emojis and applause. Business partners sent encouragement. He responded with calm confidence. Everything was on schedule. During acclimatization rotations, he called home using his satellite phone. The connection crackled under thin Himalayan air. He told Caroline that the Khumbu icefall was technical but manageable. He described Camp 2 at 6,400 meters as beautiful. He avoided describing the headaches, the insomnia, the strange metallic taste that comes with high altitude. He wanted them to believe he was in control. Inside the expedition dining tent at base camp, Daniel often spoke about preparation. He had invested nearly $90,000 into this climb. Premium guiding service, veteran Sherpas, multiple oxygen cylinders staged in advance, advanced weather forecasting from professional meteorologists, backup regulators, backup masks. He believed redundancy equaled safety. Other climbers in the tent were different. Some are firefighters. Some are lifelong alpinists. A few had spent decades climbing 7,000-meter peaks before attempting Everest. They spoke quietly about humility, about turning around when necessary. Daniel listened, but internally he measured. He had completed Ironman races in under 10 hours. He had summit Denali in marginal weather. He had endured discomfort before. Pain was temporary. Success was permanent. What he failed to realize was that Everest is not impressed by prior victories. At Camp 3 on the Lhotse face, at 7,200 meters, Daniel experienced his first serious altitude fatigue. His oxygen saturation dipped into the mid-60% range without supplemental support. He moved slower than he expected. Each step required deliberate effort, but he told no one that it unsettled him. Instead, he sent a brief message home, feeling strong. Summit windows soon. Caroline read it in their kitchen at night. She zoomed into the small attached photo, Daniel's goggles reflecting endless ice. She noticed his smile looked thinner than usual. The summit window for May 21st was announced 2 days earlier. A narrow gap between jet stream shifts. Roughly 18 to 20 hours of relatively lower wind. Hundreds of climbers chose the same date. Daniel saw it as opportunity. He did not yet understand. It was a bottleneck forming at 8,800 meters. On the evening of May 20th, at Camp 4 on the South Col, altitude 7,950 meters, he recorded a short video message for his sons. "If you're watching this," he said, oxygen mask resting at his neck, "it means I'm on the summit. Remember, anything is possible." The wind outside the tent was already rising. He slept for less than 2 hours before the summit push began. At 9:30 p.m., under a black Himalayan sky pierced with stars, Daniel clipped into the fixed line and began walking upward. He believed he was about to finish a dream. He did not know he had already entered a countdown. 2 days before the summit push, the warnings were already circulating quietly through base camp. The Department of Tourism liaison officer had confirmed what many expedition leaders already suspected. Permit numbers were at a record high. Nearly 380 foreign climbers on the south side alone, with Sherpa support staff included. That meant well over 700 people moving through the Khumbu icefall and up the southeast ridge during the same narrow weather window. Traffic at 8,700 meters is not an inconvenience. It is exposure. Meteorological briefings showed a short reduction in wind beginning late May 20th. Jet stream speeds were expected to drop from 80 miles per hour to around 30 to 35 miles per hour at summit level. But the models also showed instability building again by midday, May 21st. The window was thin, perhaps too thin. Veteran guides muttered that the timing was aggressive. One American expedition leader, who had summited 6 times before, warned his team bluntly, "If we get stuck in a queue above the balcony, we turn around." No debate. He had seen what delay does to oxygen calculations. At 3 liters per minute, a standard cylinder lasts roughly 6 hours. Most summit pushes require 8 to 12. Daniel heard these discussions. He interpreted them differently. To him, the forecast still showed green indicators. Winds under 40 miles per hour. Clear skies. No major snowfall predicted. He trusted data over instinct. He trusted the system he had paid for. but small red flags were already visible. During the final acclimatization rotation, climbers reported congestion near the Hillary Step even before the main summit wave began. Fixed ropes had limited passing points. Descending climbers would have to wait for ascending ones. Every minute spent stationary meant oxygen depletion. At Camp 3, a Sherpa quietly mentioned that regulators were icing more frequently than usual due to fluctuating temperatures between -25 and -35 degrees Celsius. Moisture from breath crystallizes quickly at those altitudes. A frozen valve can starve a climber of oxygen without warning. Daniel replaced one of his regulators as a precaution. He saw that as responsible management. At base camp, experienced climbers debated postponing their summit attempt by 24 hours. It would mean thinner crowds, but slightly stronger winds. A trade-off. Daniel's team chose May 21st. There is also the visible warning of the mountain itself. From Camp 4, at 7,950 meters, the southeast ridge could be seen cutting upward like a white blade. That afternoon, Spindrift trailed from the summit in thin streamers, evidence that winds were still active above. Nema, his Sherpa, watched the plume for a long moment. He said quietly, "If wind comes early, descent will be difficult." Daniel nodded, but he did not hesitate. What they failed to fully acknowledge was that Everest rarely punishes without signaling first. The signs were present. The math was visible, and the line of headlamps that would form that night was already predictable. On the afternoon of May 20th, at Camp 4 on the South Col, 7,950 meters above sea level, Daniel Mercer laid out his equipment with the precision of a financial audit. His down suit was custom-fitted, rated to -40 degrees Celsius. Triple-layered boots with carbon insoles. Electrically heated socks connected to lithium battery packs secured inside insulated pouches. 2 oxygen regulators. For cylinders staged between Camp 4 and higher caches. A high-end GPS unit mounted to his chest strap. Satellite tracker transmitting his position to base camp every few minutes. Nothing had been left to chance. He had taken advanced mountaineering courses in Alaska, crevasse rescue training, ice climbing certifications, weeks spent in hypoxic tents at home simulating altitudes above 6,000 meters. His resting heart rate was low, his body fat percentage minimal. He had spreadsheets tracking oxygen consumption rates. He believed he had engineered safety. Inside the tent, while wind brushed the nylon walls at 20 to 25 miles per hour, Daniel reviewed his summit plan again. Oxygen flow rate, 3 liters per minute on ascent, 2 liters per minute on descent. Estimated summit time, 7:30 a.m. Estimated total climb, 10 hours round trip. He calculated margins as if they were quarterly earnings forecasts. Nema, his Sherpa, checked the regulators with quiet efficiency. 11 summits behind him. Years spent moving through this terrain in storms Daniel could not imagine. His experience was not written on paper. It lived in muscle memory. But Daniel trusted hardware. He scrolled briefly through weather updates on his satellite device. Wind speeds were holding within predicted range. Temperatures expected to drop to -30 degrees Celsius overnight, rising slightly after sunrise. No major precipitation forecast. Everything looked aligned. Outside, dozens of other climbers prepared in similar fashion. Expensive down suits in coordinated colors. Oxygen masks tested and retested. Backup gloves secured with carabiners. Headlamps with fresh batteries. The modern Everest expedition can feel less like exploration and more like logistics. What they failed to recognize was that technology does not remove altitude. At 8,000 meters, the body does not care about brand names. The brain does not distinguish between a $10,000 setup and borrowed gear. Oxygen deprivation reduces cognition regardless of preparation. Daniel's confidence was calm, almost analytical. He was not reckless in appearance. He was methodical, organized, determined. But confidence at extreme altitude can become distortion. Shortly before 9:30 p.m., he zipped his suit fully, adjusted his mask, and stepped into the dark. The stars above the South Col were sharp and countless. The temperature had fallen to minus 28 degrees Celsius. He clipped into the fixed rope. In his mind, every variable had been accounted for. What he did not understand was that the mountain always keeps one variable hidden. By 1:30 a.m., the line of climbers had stretched thin across the slope above Camp 4. Headlamps flickered in single file, tracing the southeast ridge like a fragile chain of light. The temperature had dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Wind speeds, forecasted at 25 miles per hour, were already nudging past 35. Daniel felt strong in the first hours. His oxygen mask hissed rhythmically at 3 liters per minute. His steps were measured. Pressure breathing, inhale deeply, forcefully exhale, became automatic. The snow underfoot was firm. Crampons bit cleanly into ice. But around 3:45 a.m., approaching the balcony at roughly 8,400 meters, movement slowed. Ahead, silhouettes were no longer advancing. The line stopped. Climbers stood clipped to the fixed rope, suspended in darkness. Waiting. Waiting at 8,400 meters means oxygen continues to drain. At 3 liters per minute, a cylinder loses 180 liters every hour. A standard 4-liter cylinder pressurized to 300 bar carries roughly 1,200 liters usable. 6 hours, if everything runs perfectly. Daniel checked his gauge. He had already consumed more than expected. Wind gusts sharpened. Spindrift began sweeping across the ridge in thin sheets. The effective wind chill pushed perceived temperatures closer to minus 40 degrees Celsius. Frost formed along zippers and mask valves. Behind Daniel, a climber coughed violently through his regulator. Ahead, someone shifted nervously, boots scraping against rock beneath the snow. Nema leaned back toward him. "Traffic," he said through his mask. His voice was muffled but steady. Daniel nodded. It would clear, he assumed. But minutes stretched into half an hour. The eastern horizon lightened slightly, a faint gray replacing black. Dawn was coming, but with it, wind began to strengthen. Gusts reached 40 miles per hour. The ridge, narrow and exposed, offered no shelter. Daniel flexed his fingers inside triple-layer gloves. He could still feel them, but sensation was dulling. He shifted weight from one foot to the other to prevent numbness. His breathing felt heavier now. At this altitude, oxygen saturation can fall into the 60% range, even with supplemental flow. The brain compensates by increasing respiratory rate, but increased breathing consumes energy. Energy demands oxygen. It becomes a cycle. He checked his gauge again, lower than planned. They resumed moving slowly at 5:10 a.m., but progress was uneven. At 8,500 meters, the line thickened once more. The Hillary Step loomed above, a near-vertical rock outcrop requiring careful clipping and unclipping along a single rope. Climbers were queuing. Daniel felt irritation first. He had paid for professional coordination. He had followed timing instructions. Yet here he was immobilized. The wind rose to 45 miles per hour. Spindrift now reduced visibility to less than 30 meters in sudden bursts. His mask iced slightly at the valve. He tapped it with gloved fingers. The hiss resumed cleanly. Then came something subtler, a tremor in his legs. Not exhaustion yet, but an unfamiliar heaviness. His pace, once steady, had become mechanical. Each step required conscious effort. Nema studied him carefully. "Okay," the Sherpa asked. Daniel nodded too quickly. What he did not say was that a thin thread of doubt had begun forming. Not fear, not yet, but awareness. The summit was still above. The delay had already cost nearly 90 minutes. His oxygen cylinder was draining faster than predicted. The sun broke fully over the horizon around 6 a.m., illuminating the endless drop into Tibet. The world below looked distant and unreal. The line of climbers was now clearly visible, dozens of figures inching upward. It was beautiful and wrong. What they failed to realize was that every minute standing still at 8,700 meters was subtracting from their descent margin. Wind, 50 miles per hour. Temperature, minus 35 degrees Celsius in shadow. Oxygen, finite. And Daniel Mercer, millionaire, athlete, strategist, began to feel something he had not anticipated. The quiet beginning of fear. By 7:20 a.m., Daniel and Nema had crossed 8,750 meters. There is no tree line here, no vegetation, no color, only rock, ice, and sky. Above 8,000 meters, the Earth becomes something else entirely, a high-altitude desert suspended in the jet stream. The southeast ridge narrowed into an exposed spine, dropping thousands of meters on either side. Wind speed, 50 to 55 miles per hour. Temperature, minus 35 degrees Celsius. Oxygen saturation inside Daniel's blood, falling. The Hillary Step rose ahead, not tall but technical at that altitude. A near-vertical rock barrier at roughly 8,790 meters, guarded by a single fixed rope. Climbers ascending and descending were forced to share it. The line had not cleared. Daniel paused below the step, clipped into the rope, boots anchored in a patch of hard ice. Below him, the ridge fell away toward the south kernel above him. Perhaps 60 climbers waited in staggered formation. He checked his oxygen gauge again, lower than it should have been. Turning around now would not be simple. Descent traffic was slow. The ridge was crowded in both directions. Passing required unclipping and reclipping under wind gusts strong enough to destabilize balance. What they failed to realize was that congestion transforms retreat into hazard. At sea level, turning back is a decision. At 8,800 meters, it is an operation. Nema leaned close. "We go up quick," he said. His eyes searched Daniel's face through frosted goggles. Daniel nodded. The summit was less than 60 vertical meters above. Close enough to taste. Close enough to justify the delay. He calculated subconsciously. Finish the climb, take the photo, descend efficiently. But oxygen had been draining for nearly 9 hours. The body, at that altitude, cannot replenish. It only declines. As Daniel began ascending the Hillary Step, he felt the first real instability in his coordination. His crampons scraped against rock awkwardly. He overcorrected. His breathing accelerated beyond rhythm. Above the step, the final summit ridge stretched like a white knife edge toward the highest point on Earth. This was the moment where fate quietly seals itself. Wind gusted violently across the crest. Snow crystals struck exposed fabric like sand. Behind him, climbers were still coming up. Ahead of him, the summit waited. Turning back now would mean descending through the same traffic, with diminishing oxygen and rising winds. Continuing meant committing to the summit with almost no margin left for error. Daniel chose forward, and in that decision, high above 8,800 meters, the mountain locked the door behind him. Daniel reached the summit at 8:58 a.m. Wind speed, 55 miles per hour and rising. Temperature, minus 30 degrees Celsius. Time spent above 8,000 meters, nearly 11 hours. He stood on the highest point on Earth for less than 5 minutes. There was no celebration, only a hurried photograph. His glove came off briefly to adjust his camera. Skin met air at minus 30 degrees. Frostbite began in seconds, invisible and silent. Nema gestured sharply down. The descent began at 9:05 a.m., and almost immediately conditions shifted. The jet stream dipped south faster than forecasted. What had been strong wind became sustained force. Gusts climbed past 60 miles per hour. Spindrift thickened, blowing horizontally across the ridge. Visibility narrowed to less than 20 meters in sudden bursts. The summit ridge, narrow and unforgiving, disappeared into white. Daniel moved carefully at first, front pointing with crampons. Descending facing outward, clipped to the fixed rope. But traffic was heavier now. Climbers were coming up as others tried to come down. Bottlenecks formed at every anchor point. Each stop meant standing still in extreme wind. Each minute meant oxygen draining. He checked his gauge. Lower than safe. They reached the top of the Hillary Step again around 9:40 a.m. The queue was worse than before. Climbers were stalled mid-descent, tangled in fixed lines, struggling to coordinate movement. Wind, 65 miles per hour. Snow blasted into faces. Goggles iced. Masks rattled under pressure. Daniel felt his breathing become labored. The hiss of oxygen seemed weaker. He tapped the regulator. It responded but faintly. Ice crystals formed along the valve edges. His legs trembled. At 8,780 meters, hypoxia intensifies rapidly without adequate oxygen flow. Judgment dulls. Peripheral vision narrows. Reaction time slows by measurable fractions. Daniel misjudged a step. His crampon slipped on exposed rock beneath thin snow. His body lurched sideways toward the Kangshung face, a drop of nearly 3,000 meters into Tibet. The rope caught him. Nema grabbed his harness and stabilized him. They did not speak. Words were expensive. They waited again, and the wind rose higher. Visibility dropped into near whiteout conditions. The world reduced to blowing snow and the faint silhouette of climbers ahead. Landmarks vanished. The horizon disappeared. Daniel's oxygen cylinder sputtered. He checked the valve again. Nearly empty. He fumbled the switch to his spare tank, fingers stiff and unresponsive. Fine motor control deteriorates quickly at minus 35 degrees Celsius. Nema assisted, but even that process cost minutes. The new cylinder engaged, but the flow felt insufficient. His breathing became frantic, rapid, shallow, ineffective. Panic began as a biological response, not an emotional one. The body sensed oxygen deprivation and reacted. Heart rate accelerated. Muscles demanded more fuel. He tried to steady himself. Below them, another climber sat motionless beside the rope. Slumped, unresponsive. Others stepped around him carefully, unable to help. They didn't know if he was alive. At 8,700 meters, Daniel's movements slowed dramatically. His speech, when he tried to respond to Nema, was slurred. Words blurred together. His thoughts fragmented. The wind howled continuously now, 70 miles per hour. Snow erased tracks behind them. The ridge looked unfamiliar, distorted by blowing ice. The simple path they had ascended hours earlier felt foreign. Exhaustion became total. Each step required full-body effort. Quadriceps burned. Calves shook uncontrollably. His gloved hands no longer felt like his own. He stumbled again, this time harder. Nema pulled him upright. "Focus," he said sharply. But focus requires oxygen, and Daniel's supply was no longer reliable. Above 8,600 meters, the margin had disappeared completely. Chaos on Everest does not look dramatic. It looks like small failures compounding. Wind, delay, ice, fatigue, a misstep, a half-empty cylinder, and a man who could no longer distinguish between determination and danger. At approximately 10:25 a.m., just below 8,650 meters on the southeast ridge, Daniel's oxygen flow weakened again. Wind speed had stabilized at nearly 70 miles per hour. Spindrift moved in constant sheets across the ridge. The temperature, factoring wind chill, pushed below minus 40 degrees Celsius. Exposed skin could freeze in under 2 minutes. Daniel stopped moving. At first, it looked like fatigue. He leaned forward slightly, one hand resting on his thigh, the other clipped to the fixed rope. His breathing through the mask had become erratic, sharp inhales followed by long pauses. Nema checked the cylinder. Pressure was critically low. There were no additional spares within immediate reach. They were still above the balcony, too far from the oxygen caches staged lower on the route. Traffic continued in both directions, climbers squeezing past carefully in the wind. Daniel attempted to step down. His right foot failed to anchor properly. His crampons skidded against a patch of blue ice exposed by wind scour. He dropped to one knee, tethered to the rope. Nema secured him upright again. But something had shifted inside Daniel. Hypoxia had progressed beyond manageable levels. Without sufficient oxygen flow, at 8,600 meters, arterial saturation can drop below 50%. The brain begins to shut down non-essential function. Confusion replaces clarity. Daniel's speech dissolved into fragments. He tried to adjust his mask again, removing one glove briefly to clear ice from the regulator. The skin of his fingers stiffened almost immediately in the wind. When he replaced the glove, his dexterity was gone. He blinked slowly. Then he sat down. Not deliberately, not dramatically, His legs simply folded beneath him. At that altitude, sitting down is rarely rest. It is surrender. Nema shook him, tapped his helmet, increased the regulator flow in a final attempt to push more oxygen through the nearly depleted cylinder. The hiss was weak. Daniel's head tilted backward slightly. His eyes remained open, but unfocused. Wind roared across the ridge, flattening loose snow against his suit. Ice crystals gathered along his mask and lashes. Climbers stepped around them, some offering brief glances, none able to stop long without risking their own survival. At 8,650 meters, rescue is almost impossible. Nema attempted to lift him to his feet. Daniel could not stand. His breathing slowed, shallow, spaced apart. Core temperature began dropping rapidly. Hypothermia layered on a hypoxia. Heart rhythm destabilized. The body, already starved of oxygen, could not generate heat. There was no avalanche, no dramatic fall into the abyss. Only exposure. Only the quiet failure of organs deprived too long. At approximately 10:47 a.m., Daniel Mercer stopped responding entirely. The wind did not change. The line of climbers continued moving, and the mountain remained exactly as it had been before he arrived. For several minutes after Daniel collapsed, Nema refused to accept what his eyes were telling him. He unclipped his own safety line briefly and knelt beside him, anchoring both of them to the fixed rope. Wind continued to strike the ridge at nearly 70 miles per hour. Snow gathered along Daniel's shoulders, forming a thin white layer against his red-down suit. Nepal time 10:50. Someone's radio crackled faintly from above. Nema removed Daniel's oxygen mask and checked for airflow directly. There was still breath, shallow, irregular, spaced too far apart. His pulse, when felt through layers of insulated fabric at the neck, was weak and inconsistent. At 8,650 meters, even kneeling feels like sprinting. Nema attempted to stimulate him. He struck his shoulders firmly, called his name repeatedly, adjusted the regulator again, forcing the remaining oxygen through the line. A climber descending stopped briefly and offered a half-full cylinder. It was clipped on quickly. Flow increased to 4 liters per minute. For a moment, Daniel's chest rose more steadily. Hope returned. They didn't know that hope at that altitude can be deceptive. Daniel's eyes opened slightly. He seemed to look through Nema rather than at him. His lips moved. The words were indistinct, fragments about home, about the boys, about finishing. Then his body slackened again. Nema attempted chest compressions. At sea level, CPR can circulate oxygenated blood long enough for recovery. At 8,650 meters, there's almost no oxygen to circulate. Each compression drained Nema's own strength. His breathing grew ragged inside his mask. His vision narrowed. He managed perhaps 30 compressions before stopping. The wind did not pause. Snow continued to drift across them. Climbers descended carefully around the scene, some whispering, some avoiding eye contact. Everyone understood the physics. Everyone understood the limit. Core temperature drops rapidly when a body stops generating heat. Within minutes, Daniel's exposed skin stiffened. Ice formed along his eyelashes. The borrowed oxygen cylinder hissed uselessly into a body that could no longer process it. Nema leaned close once more. He spoke quietly in Nepali, words of apology, of effort, of acceptance. Daniel Mercer's breathing slowed again, then stopped. No dramatic final movement, no final speech, just a gradual separation of sound, the wind growing louder, the human noise fading. At 11:12 a.m., high on the southeast ridge of Mount Everest, the struggle ended. Nema remained kneeling for a few seconds longer, gloved hand resting on Daniel's shoulder. Then, with visible reluctance, he clipped back into the rope. Above 8,600 meters, survival sometimes demands leaving someone behind. And in that moment, the realization became permanent. By late afternoon, the wind had eased slightly, dropping to 45 miles per hour, but the damage had already been done. Radio transmissions reached base camp around 1:30 p.m. The report was brief. A climber unresponsive below the balcony. Oxygen depletion. Exposure. No viable recovery at that altitude during active summit traffic. High-altitude rescue on Everest is limited by physics. Above 8,000 meters, helicopters cannot operate safely. Retrieval requires teams of Sherpas hauling a body down through fixed lines in extreme cold at enormous personal risk. It would not happen that day. Daniel Mercer remained where he had fallen, secured to the rope along the southeast ridge at approximately 8,650 meters. His body, preserved by temperatures below -30 degrees Celsius, would become part of the mountain's silent geography. At base camp, expedition leaders reconstructed the timeline carefully. Summit congestion had extended exposure by nearly 2 hours. Oxygen calculations had not accounted for prolonged bottlenecks. The jet stream had shifted earlier than forecasted, increasing wind speeds beyond safe descent margins. But beneath the technical explanations lay a simpler truth. Everest punishes overconfidence. Money had purchased equipment, forecasting, logistics, and access. It had not purchased experience under extreme hypoxic stress. It had not purchased humility at the point of no return. Weeks later, in Dallas, Caroline received the final confirmation. There was no dramatic conclusion, no moral victory, no redemption arc, only a mountain that remained exactly where it had always been, indifferent to ambition. Above 8,000 meters, the human body negotiates survival minute by minute. And sometimes, when pride moves faster than judgment, the mountain simply waits. On May 21st, 2019, it waited long enough.